Welcome, everyone, to the Chief Executive Summit. We've had the opportunity for the last quarter century now, starting with Steve Jobs back when he didn't even know what a webinar was, to do a conversation that digs deep into the history of and the leadership journey of people trying to build and create and transform the world through organizations, through the national work that they do. And, I really have the pleasure of being able to talk to people who are now involved in what is appearing to be the most volatile time in history. That seems to work no matter when you talk about it throughout history. So today I have Barbara Humpton, who's the CEO of Siemens USA, and Scott Osman, who's the CEO of 100 Coaches. And I'm just delighted to have you both. Thank you so much for being here.
Great to be with you, Mark.
Yeah, great to be with you, Mark.
So Barbara, I think about the leadership journey in the most challenging of times. Could you talk about how you've been an optimist and how you think about optimism as a chief executive in these turbulent times?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I have the privilege of leading Siemens in the US. And for your audience who doesn't yet know Siemens, think of us as a huge global powerhouse in many fields that matter in the moment. Siemens has always focused on the growing infrastructure that supports the economy. We're in the backbone of economies all around the world. So for 160 years in the United States, Siemens has been attending to electrification, automation, digitalization. You'll find us in transportation, bringing new high-speed rail to the US. You'll find us in manufacturing, bringing the digital as well as hardware tools of modern manufacturing. You'll find us in the built infrastructure, helping to manage buildings, but also bringing low and medium voltage electricity. And when you think about it, those are the things that line up with national priorities in the moment. We're about to enter a new phase of economic growth while we're in a moment of economic disruption. But the underlying fundamentals of what's possible now with the technology that's been introduced, Siemens is actually opening up a new tech sector, the industrial tech sector. And so this leadership journey that I've been on has been one of taking personal know-how and a sense that with technology, we can solve problems that we could never even approach before. That optimism that says we have the tools we need and all we need is the willpower to get going. That I figured that's my role in the world in this moment. And it's a huge privilege to serve both the Siemens Corporation as well as the citizens of the United States with helping them build the future.
When you think about that future, that you have the opportunity to collaborate across the world and inspire leaders to lead, to take that leadership journey, what do you wish you knew when you started that process that you've learned in the most recent times? In other words, what would be some advice that you give to your earlier self, like you have?
It's amazing. The advice I would give my earlier self is you are enough. The skills you have are needed. That you've got tools and talents that others don't have, right? You have things you can bring to the tables that others can't. And we were all raised at a time. I'm going to tell you, I've been in business over 40 years. So when I was a youngin', we were all told that we had to morph ourselves into the image of the perfect leader. And in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. What we actually need to do is unleash the gifts we've been given in service to the greater objectives. And man, when we do that, we can stop worrying about whether we're doing things right, but instead know that we have a perspective that contributes to the ultimate objective, then we can really get going. So I love working with leaders who have that tendency to rush to the biggest problem instead of trying to hide from it and maybe blame others. Rush to the biggest problem and roll up their sleeves and figure out what needs to be done now.
I love that. It certainly feels like the spirit of your Optimist podcast that you do. And could you frame what that means to you in terms of being the hard optimist that you mentioned?
Yeah. In the midst of COVID, our team here at Siemens said, we think now's a really good time to launch a podcast. We'd love for you to be able to reach other people with this message of doing what we can, right? Ignoring the things that we can't control, not ignoring them, but understanding the things we can't control, and then bringing action. And so, what we did, that I will tell you, the premise of the Optimistic Outlook podcast is this: it's moments of disruption that give us the best opportunity to shape the future. Right? It's moments of disruption when everybody says, "Ooh, what do we do now?" When people are questioning everything, it's the perfect time to bring solutions forward. So, by keeping our eye on the horizon, where are we trying to go in the long run? We can help steer the ship in the interim. And
Mhm.
so, what's been fun with the podcast is to bring on guests who are experts in all kinds of fields. What's the future of the electric grid, manufacturing, workforce development? Talk to people who have know-how. Now, this is hard optimism, right? This is the optimism that says, I don't shy away from what the problems are. What I do is I get to work.
Mm.
Scott and I have a mutual friend, a mentor, and a colleague in the 100 Coaches, Hubert Joly, who's the former CEO of Best Buy. And he always talks about how pressure is a privilege. Uh, and he's the first to say, I'm the one who needs coaching. I think, Scott, you have something to say about his viewpoint on that, having written a book about being coachable.
Yeah, he's remarkable. I think his big message, his big life story is humility. And Barbara reminds me a lot about what you're talking about not trying to be the leader that somebody else thinks you should be, but being the leader that you are, which is also being the leader in your time, right? The leader that you need to be is the leader you need to be right now, where you are. In Hubert's story, is he came in during the massive disruption, I mean, massive disruption of his industry at Best Buy. Circuit City had already gone out of business. Many other big box had already gone out of business, and he didn't have solutions. And so he had the humility to go into the stores and say, "Hey, I'm your CEO, and I don't have the answers. I need your help." And by drawing on the wisdom of his employees, he brought them in, and to this day, I think is really admired by them. But I love the way you've reframed the whole notion of what leadership is really all about. And like Mark said, the privilege of leadership is to operate under pressure, but also, as you're saying, like to be the optimist.
Mm.
Because if the CEO isn't the optimist, then who's going to take the company into the next realm it has to be in? Are there any great stories that you have of like moments where like you had to dig deep to find your optimism?
Yeah. I'll tell you about the worst day of my career.
Hmm.
On the worst day of my career, I was invited to my boss's boss's office. And my boss had called me and said, "Hey, you're going to be called in." And I just brace yourself and call me right after. I had no idea what I was going to encounter, but what I met was not only my boss's boss, but our head of human resources. That's never a good sign.
Mm-hmm.
They shared with me that they had done a review of all of the positions in the company to define, find the hardest jobs, the ones that would turn out to be a great proving ground for future CEOs. And they had determined that I was in one of those roles. And they asked me to step aside so that they could put one of the CEO candidates of the company into the role. My heavens, my heavens. What do
Congratulations.
What do you say to that? Now, and what they said was, look, you could be the deputy and support this individual, and maybe you'll someday be able to step back into the job, or come back and tell us what you'd like to do. Which, hey, wow, that's wonderful. So I left that day. I made a couple of phone calls, one to my boss, and I got a couple of, very choice words from him, "Rah, rah, rah," and then called a former mentor who said, choice words plus, "Hey, have you thought about putting your resume up on this new thing called LinkedIn? In essence, you should quit." I went home though, and the question I asked my husband was, "Hey, let's imagine our lives 10 years from now. And then fill in this blank. Aren't we glad we, dot, dot, dot. What should I ask for? And Dave looked at me and he said, well, let's see, our parents are healthy, our kids are in college. Why don't we look for an international assignment? I think we'd be glad if we did an international assignment. So I went back the next day and presented my heart's desire. And the company got to work, oh yeah, we're going to send you on a scouting mission to Australia. And it was, kind of an exciting time. But here's what I've learned. It turns out the phone started to ring. That LinkedIn thing actually led to a change, yes, out of the company. What resulted was the opportunity, because I was outside of the company, for my mentor who left and joined Siemens to call me up. She wasn't poaching from our past company. She was calling someone she had worked with before to come join her at Siemens. I mean, it was a long and winding road, but honestly, I would not be here today if that had not happened. I wouldn't be here today. So I've had the privilege of giving a commencement address on this topic. And the closing line was, graduates, may the worst days of your career lead to your very best. Out of all this, I'm a big believer in the power of vision. Just imagine what could be. And it turns out that that position that I had held really was a good training program for being a CEO.
That's amazing. When you think about then gravitating in this direction, was that a moment when you thought you might have the ambition for that office? Did you think about how you might go about preparing for it? What was your process from there? And once having landed in this great new location?
Well, Mark, I will tell you that, again, think about how we were raised in the 1980s. One of the things that I'd been told very, very clearly is you can't be a mother and an executive. You have to choose. And by the time I got that coaching, I already had 2 children. So I had already made my choice. So I had no conception that, I might be an executive of a company someday. But what I did know was I loved the work I was doing. So I'll just share with you, I've always been one of those mission-driven people. In the early days, I got to work on satellite command and control. I helped IBM deliver the ground control segment of the global positioning system. And I helped Lockheed Martin work with Customs and Border Protection on border security. I helped the FBI on biometrics, right? These were all really exciting missions that enhanced national security. And so for me, it was rush to the problem. It was always answering the call, go where you're asked to be. And often, being given the ugly jobs, Barb, can you help us clean this up?
Yeah.
But that I will tell you that motivation of solve a problem, build teams. What I discovered was that in most cases it was that people weren't communicating with each other. So superpowers in communication and setting tables where everybody was heard and then began to work together. That again, honing skills to win new business, perform business. Manage people. I didn't recognize then that, yes, I was building muscles I would need later. So it was not until arriving at Siemens and when this particular role I'm in today opened up and a colleague came to see me and said, I think you'd be really good at that. It was the first time in my career I actually raised my hand and said, hey, I'm here, I'm interested, and I'm ready. So I've learned now that there's real power in raising your hand, volunteering for the job that you think could be the dream job. And let me tell you this, with all of the pain that comes with, difficult economic times, this has been my dream job.
When you think about that transformation that you took yourself through because of the needs involved, so you have a mission, that's the glamorous part. And then you were willing to do the work, to do the conditioning, build the muscles, and learn the extra skills. Is that your advice for people? Basically, where you are, you try to be the best you can be in that role?
Yes. It's interesting. I had a mentor at one point along the way who said, you've got to do every job like you're the Queen of England. And I'm like, wait, wear a tiara? What are you talking about? And her reaction was, her advice was, Think about if you were the Queen of England and you had to do the job as if you could never give it up.
Mm.
You make different decisions if you're in it forever.
Mm.
I really like that frame of mind because you think and act like a steward of the mission of the organization. All too often I see people using positions as a rung on a ladder. I'll do this as my launching pad for the next thing. No, what if you had to do it forever? Would you actually clean up that mess on aisle three? And the fact is you do behave differently. Um, I always search, as I say, for the people who have an inclination toward action, toward rolling up the sleeves and getting things done themselves. I have an attraction to people who aren't interested in polishing a resume, but are interested in having impact. And I really think that it's kind of a cool time for us at Siemens because we've been through a couple of decades of IT transforming the world, right? Bringing all kinds of new tools to us. But IT is where data sits. Operational technology, OT, that Siemens manages is where data is. And this is where we can have a lot of impact. So it's a great field for people who are looking to lead into a huge new tech sector, and not because they want the title, but because they want to get things done.
That's
Yeah.
a very different way of describing the stepping stone. Instead, it's ownership and then demonstrating that for impact. What's
Yeah, Mark, let me just jump in and say, like, so interesting when we think about CO readiness. Um, Very often, sort of in the past, you might have thought of somebody who wants to be the CEO and how do they prepare themselves and get ready. And what I love about your story, both explicit and not said, is it doesn't sound like your aspiration was to be CEO, right? It sounds like your aspiration was wherever you were to do the best job possible there. And through that process, you became CEO ready. And Mark, I'd say we're seeing that more and more. But Barbara, what a beautiful example of that. And then when the time came, raised your hand.
That was the thing that had just never occurred to me before, right? We especially if you grow up in large organizations, there's the
Hmm.
idea that the powers that be know. They know what they're looking for. They know who they want. They're mentoring and getting people ready. And again, my whole mindset was, oh no, I don't even qualify.
Yeah.
those uh, stakeholders that are involved in making the decision to both help you get skilled, to mentor you, and then eventually be selected for the role? Could you talk about how you think about those stakeholders? When you're becoming CEO ready, I find it's one of the areas that's the most underestimated because you get exposure, maybe to a board during a dinner, or you're speaking in your swim lane on your topic during a board of directors meeting or in other executive sessions that you have. But the depth of the relationships is something that is often underestimated as people are becoming CEO ready. Could you talk about how to think about who the stakeholders are and how to build trust?
Yes. And this is fascinating because there are a lot of people looking up to try to build those relationships, but it turns out that there are relationships all around us, and certainly people reporting to us who play a key role in whether or not we ultimately become candidates.
Mm.
Man, I had just a couple of quick stories. I had a mentee at one point who was terribly focused. I'm going to say terribly focused on his goal of becoming CEO of another company. And everything was about the next move, the next move, the next move. And he was actually being presented with, he was leading a business that was in one of the most complex and difficult scenarios you could possibly imagine. There was a product to be developed that wasn't meeting expectations. There were stakeholders who had to be aligned, and his whole focus was up. And it
Mm.
was, hey, I'm going to go interview for this next thing, over in the next county to, try to get my, polish things up. And the conversation with him that I had was, this next 6 months in the role that you currently have is rare. Rarely do people get the real experience of dealing with a real crisis. And I mean, you can't make these things happen. So the fact that you're in one and you have the opportunity to be in the driver's seat through the crisis, this next 6 months is going to be the most valuable learning period potentially of your entire career. Are you really going to give that up for a title in another role? Turns out he stayed. And I'm pleased to say he's doing well. But back to the stakeholders thing, what he demonstrated through that was support to his team. And his team, of course, started spreading the word about fantastic leader. What did you see how he handled the thus and so? He actually then also influenced customers, right? And partners. So there's that whole network, right, that needs to be honored and understood and are essential building blocks, ultimately leading up to this question of the board. Now, fascinating thing about the board, you go through this whole process of presenting to boards. Before you're ever on a board, you can feel like, again, these folks are on mighty pedestals, and so it's intimidating. And you practice, you sweat, you hope you perform well. And I was really happy to have a mentor who said to me, "Hey, these are people with insight who actually want to be consulted." And the most powerful thing you can do is literally reach out and ask for their insight. Hey, I'd love to share something with you. I'd appreciate your perspective on this matter. As soon as I got into a working relationship with people who had been hired by the company to help us, right? But who often felt that they were reserved for, I don't know, rubber stamp, kind of purposes, governance purposes alone. It changed the whole relationship, and of course led to not only collegiality, but really creative work together in the boardroom.
That's spectacular, because it's interesting how many board members do think of themselves as volunteers. They're coming from great accomplishment. They have day jobs, or they already rocked it in many day jobs before they came here. So I'm only coming to serve and help and support. And the biggest surprise I think that Scott and I still get when we're talking to senior people is just what a compliment it is when you ask for advice in the 360 from all levels of the organization. Just the fact that you were willing and interested, sincerely.
And there's something Scott said earlier, I think ties into this, which is, I think the most powerful words any leader can utter are, "What do you think?" I've worked with leaders who wanted to be know-it-alls. Just another quick story. I remember having someone reporting to me at one point, and he was, chief engineer on a massive project. And he said, "Oh, I can't handle the workload. Every single day I have to have a 2-hour meeting where everybody comes into the room and they just ask me questions and I have to give them the answers. I don't know what to do. They're not doing their jobs." And my first question to him was, "Well, do you give them answers?" He said, "Well, of course I know." I said, "Well, there's your problem."
Wow.
And that quick, "Well, tell me what you think." And, in a matter of weeks, he had people feeling affirmed that, yeah, their own thinking was aligned with the chief engineer. "Oh, yeah, wait, I got this. I know how he would answer it. And I can figure it out myself." I think this happens in so many ways. So whether we're talking to people who work for us or whether we're talking to the people we work for, it's a really powerful question.
Well, that's one of the reasons we love doing this program, because we get to ask the people who have had a front row seat in really creating impact, and your vision just permeates your conversation, and we feel it very deeply. And I have the privilege of working with Scott Osman at the 100 Coaches Agency as he thinks about how mentorship and the coaching process permeates kind of the process of really getting better every day at what we do. Barbara, you talked about a mentor who gave you that advice. Maybe we could close with something that you could share with us about what it means to be a mentor and what your best coaching experience might have been if you coached.
Yeah, in terms of being a mentor, it's interesting. I've participated in various companies who have programs, and I'm going to assign you to an individual, and we're going to keep track of how often you're meeting and what you're talking about. My experience has been that those don't yield a lot of fruit. What has worked are the relationships where the mentee actually drives the agenda and the cadence. I've had a couple of cases even of, I'll say, mentees firing themselves. If we set up regular ongoing meetings and you have to miss or reschedule more than one or two, you're probably not finding enough value out of the conversation we're having. So I think we've accomplished all we can. Congratulations, you've graduated. So I'm a big believer in if it really is about driving the mentee's career development, then I need to let them drive.
Mhm.
When it comes to the best mentoring advice I've gotten, can I just tell you, it's so funny because I've had these so many wonderful privileged moments throughout a long career that again weren't sanctioned by anyone because no one had me on a talent list.
Hmm.
So, but it was people who spent the time. It was a chief engineer on a project I worked on who said it's moments of disruption that give us the best opportunity to shape the future, right? It's mentees along the way who taught me the core things like all org charts are wrong. So work your network instead of your org chart. That it's those life lessons that have shaped my personal career. But the one I think that had the greatest impact and that led to this role is the one who said, Barb, have you studied the art of attraction? And I said, what? I've never heard of it. He said, well, you practice it naturally. This idea that if you focus on a goal, focus on a vision, your heart's desire, it will come to you and the road will open up joyfully. And just my road in the just the sheer interview process that resulted in me being in this position was an illustration of the art of attraction. And it's a fun story that leads me to say to others that this really what we should be focusing on is joy.
Hmm.
It's the things that are in front of us can be accomplished. And if we bring our whole heart and joy to it, not only are we going to get it done, but we're going to have a lot of fun along the way.
Yeah, Barbara, I just have to make this observation. Mark coaches some of the greatest CEOs of all time, in our time, um, and um, and the whole purpose of coaching and leadership, leaders like you, is to create what we call flourishing. And I think it sometimes goes a little bit unsaid, and it should be said. At some of the greatest coaching and mentoring is actually how you show up in the organization, and it's indirect. Like the example you set on, I mean, I'm just listening to how you showed up on this conversation. I imagine you show up this way almost every day. Um, and having people see that you can be successful like this, the example you set, the work that you do, so important to be a great CEO, so much more important to show an example of what a great CEO looks like and acts like. And as you just said, brings joy to the work. It's just so, I'm so grateful that you're doing the work, that we get to talk to you today. But really to set an example of what's possible um, through the lens of the optimist.
Thank you.
Scott, I can't tell you how much it means to hear those words from you. And Mark, the opportunity to be with you today, have this conversation. Honestly, this is part of my dream come true.
Mm.
Thank you so much. We so appreciate it.